Hi there, my friends, and welcome to Master of Horror, where I bring you the scariest paranormal true stories that I've ever come by. Please enjoy these stories, and please don't forget to leave your nightlight on. Paranormal Scary True Story number 1. The Basement Ouija Board. When I was 16, this happened. I am now 28 years old. I never talked about this to anyone except for those that were present when this happened. This experience has scared me, and the events that took place will stick with me until the day I die. When I was a teenager, I never really talked to anyone outside of my family, and I grew up in a small town in Italy, which was completely isolated and surrounded by mountains. Being a small village, everyone knew each other. This, in particular day, was my cousin's birthday. News around the area does travel fast, so there were a lot of people there already when I got there. When I arrived, there were people jumping off the roofs into the pool. They were drinking, smoking, the usual stuff at parties. After the party died down, my cousins and I, along with a couple of her friends, stayed for a while longer. My cousin then pulled out an old Ouija board that my aunt had bought for her on holiday while she was in the United States. Back then, I really wasn't a believer of a ghost or paranormal, and I would usually make stupid remarks regarding the paranormal. But what happened that night changed everything. At that moment, I didn't believe that some board could contact anything from the afterlife. We all sat down in the living room in front of the sofa and set everything up. I got this gut feeling that something wasn't quite right about this board. I was half tempted to just throw it in the trash. When everything was ready, I was the first one to ask a question. I said, "Can you give me a haircut?" It was as a joke, just to break the tension. But the girl started getting angry at me and chastising me, and said that I could get lost if I'm not going to take this seriously. I said, "Screw this, that I'm out of here." But before I could leave, my cousin said, "But wait, can you just stop being an ass and just go along with it? It's my birthday after all." After feeling a little guilty, I reluctantly sat back down and watched them move the planchette from letter to letter. I ended up dozing off when suddenly I was snapped back to reality by my cousin screaming. She screamed so loud that I bet every single person outside of that house could hear it. I sat up and saw that she was crying, and then I noticed that her arm had been scratched. At first, I thought they were just messing with me, but then I noticed that my cousin was scared out of her mind. "I'm throwing this damn thing out," I said, as I picked up the board and threw it through the open basement door. It landed on the bottom of the steps. I then asked the girls what had happened. They said it scratched her. While I was sitting on the floor dozing off, something evil scratched my cousin. The girls then walked my cousin to her bedroom, leaving me by myself. After staring at the open basement door for a while, I decided to call it a night. I grabbed some snacks from the kitchen and sat down to watch TV. At about 2:30 in the morning, I started to get really sleepy, so I stretched out on the couch and closed my eyes. But after a few moments, I heard these painful scratching sounds, like long steel nails being dragged across wood. I got up and made my way to where the sound was coming from. I hadn't realized it, but I found myself at the basement doorway again. I opened it without a second thought, but the moment I did, there was nothing. It was just a dark, silent, motionless basement. I was way too tired for this, so I made my way to my cousin's bedroom. But to my absolute astonishment, the three of them were all sitting on the floor in a circle, moving the planchette across the Ouija board. "Really? You're messing with that thing after what just happened?" I said to them. They all looked up at me. But before anyone could respond, we all heard a loud cracking sound coming from the hallway. I had rushed back into the room that I had just come from. The basement door was completely destroyed, as if someone had smashed it right off its hinges, sending the pieces down the basement steps. We rushed to the basement doorway. I said, "Everyone, stay behind me. We'll all go down together." I had grabbed a candle that was resting on the dresser next to the doorway and had one of the girls light it up. Together, we all just descended the creaky steps. But as soon as we got to the bottom, I got this awful feeling that something was down there with us. Something evil. Don't ask me how, but I somehow knew that something was on the ceiling right above us. I was scared to look up, but I knew that I had to. The dim candle light revealed a dark shadow-like form above us. It clung to the ceiling like a spider. I then saw its horrifying face staring right back at me. I fell backwards and said, "Everyone, get the hell out of here now." I led the girls back up the stairs and into my cousin's bedroom. After a while of pressing against the locked door of the room that we were in, and my heart beating out of my chest and listening to my cousin's cry, I then slowly sat down against the door and dozed off. Looking back at it was a dumb decision to stay in that house. To this day, I still haven't gotten an explanation of how the Ouija board went from the bottom of the basement steps to my cousin's bedroom. I am now a firm believer in the paranormal. Paranormal, scary, true story number 2, the Ouija board. These events took place in the summer of 2014, and I had just graduated from high school. I was enjoying my summer vacation before I had to set off to college. I really didn't have too many friends. Among the few that I did have was Phil, a pretty close friend of mine. I had a hobby of going to garage sales, and whenever I would see a sign, I would usually rush to it. I don't ever look for anything in particular. I just see if anything catches my eye, and if it's within my price range, I will most likely get it. So when I stumbled upon an old Ouija board one day, I got pretty excited. I have heard about people using Ouija boards to communicate with spirits, but I wasn't sure if the whole thing was real or not. So after bringing home the Ouija board, I called up Phil to see if we could try it out and if he was down for it. And we waited until my parents and my sister were out of the house. My family went out to eat that night, and I told them that I really didn't feel like going out and wanted to get some rest. So around 8 o'clock, they left, and about 30 minutes later, Phil was at my door. We wasted no time in setting everything up. Now at this point, both me and Phil had no idea. Both me and Phil had no dead relatives that we had known personally to contact, so we both just wanted to see if we could communicate with any wandering ghosts. So once the lights were off and the candles were lit, Phil started to get hesitant. He said, "Are you sure we should be doing this? What if we get possessed or something?" That's when I told him, "Come on, don't be a puss. This is our chance to find out if this thing actually works." That's when he hesitantly placed his hand on the planchette. I then placed mine. I then asked if anyone was here. The planchette then slowly moved to the word yes. Phil asked me, "You're not moving it, are you?" I then told him no, that I was not. "Are you a good spirit?" I then asked. The planchette then slowly moved to the word no. I then looked at Phil's face, and he looked as if he was getting a panic attack. "I told you this was a bad idea," Phil said. Looking back, he was correct. Despite him saying this, I made a really dumb decision by continuing the game. I told him to just calm down, and nothing happened so far. Let's just see what it has to say. I then asked the spirit directly, "What do you want?" The planchette then spelled out a message: "Your lives." All of a sudden, the candles blew out and the room went dark. That's when I heard a strange thump right next to us. I bolted for the light switch and switched it on. And what I saw next chilled me to the bone. Near inches from Phil's head was a fork embedded into the wall behind him. It was the same fork I had used earlier and tossed it into the sink. Phil turned and looked at it and went crazy. "Screw this, man. I knew this was a bad idea from the beginning. I'm out of here," Phil said. I didn't stop him. In fact, I couldn't even move. I just sat there looking at the fork in the wall in disbelief. After hearing the door slam, I remembered that my family would be home any time. So I quickly put the board back into the box. I put the candles back in their usual spots, and I finally unstuck the fork from the wall and threw it back into the sink. Once I was in bed is when my mind began to race, and I started to wonder, did all that really just happen? Did we actually make contact with something? I finally then fell asleep. Shortly after, I did not know what time it was, but I woke up on my backside. The only lighting that was coming into the room was the moonlight. I tried to flip back onto my side, only to realize that I could not even move. I kept trying, but my body would not budge. I admittedly became unsettled. I've never experienced sleep paralysis before, yet here I was, still as a statue, unable to move, not even 1 inch. It was then that I was able to look around the room, and what I saw petrified me to the core, and I will never forget it to this day. In front of my sliding closet doors was a black human-like mass. The figure was way too thin to be my father. Once my eyes adjusted to the lighting, I saw more detail. It was about 9 feet tall. Its eyes were 2 red circles. Whatever it was unearthly and terrifying. It was definitely not human. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, it began to move towards me and slowly approach me, stopping at the foot of my bed. Its arms began to stretch, extending to the floor. I then saw its arms slowly creeping up on the side of the bed next to me. I still couldn't move. I was unable to do anything. I could only watch in terror as its arms began to wrap around my forearms like a snake, squeezing me. I stared into its red eyes as its jaws began to open. The last thing I remember is the thing leaping forward onto the bed. I finally jolted awake, letting out the loudest scream that I could possibly utter. It was only after my family burst into my room that I realized that I could move again. My mother immediately came to check on me as my father and sister stared at me from the doorway. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. When the morning came, I called Phil and told him everything that happened. It turns out he had the same nightmare as me. However, in his, the creature did not attack him. We both concluded that what we contacted that night was extremely hostile entity. We both knew what had to be done. He came back later that afternoon, and we threw the board into the fire pit and burned it until there was nothing left. Ever since then, neither of us has had another encounter. So my message to all those that are listening is, do not mess with Ouija boards.
The Ouija board ghost.
Many people have Ouija boards sitting in their closet, somewhere collecting dust. Most people have never even used a Ouija board. I found out what Ouija boards were when I was 16, and when I asked my parents if we had one in our house, my mom told us yes, she did have one, buried somewhere in the closet with all the other board games. That closet was located in the basement. It was a small closet with a bunch of my parents' old stuff. I was pretty intrigued in using a Ouija board because I was kind of superstitious. I was able to dig through the closet without making a mess or displacing anything. Eventually, I found the old dusty box that just said Ouija on it and a planchette that moves around the board. The box was kind of falling apart on the edges, even though my mom said they've only used it once or twice. The first thing I did was text a few of my friends to come use the Ouija board with me that weekend when we'd be home alone to make it scarier. My friend Ed, who was 16, had a car, so he picked up another friend of mine, Dan, and they came right over to my house. It was already pretty late, I would say about 10 o'clock p.m. It definitely was dark outside. My parents were going to be gone for a couple of nights, and my younger brother Adam, of 12 years old, was home. So I asked him if he wanted to join as well. We were all going to play on the floor in the loft area, which was converted to my bedroom. We turned off the lights and turned on a flashlight and put it on the floor in the corner of the room, pointed toward the board. All four of us sat on one side of the board, and we held a planchette and started asking questions. We asked basic questions. I said, if there's somebody here, please move the planchette. Then, for the first time, it started to move. It slowly moved to the word yes. Adam asked, how old are you? And the planchette moved to the number 6, then to the number 7, 67. We looked at each other, and I suspected one of them were moving it. I'm sure the others did too. We all played along and just kept going with it. Eventually, I asked the board, are you a demon? And the planchette slowly moved to the word yes. At this point, we all laughed, knowing one of us was messing around. But then, suddenly, at that moment, the flashlight turned off, and that's when all of us stopped laughing and got really scared. Who did that? Someone asked. But it was clearly none of us. You see, the flashlight was all the way in the corner of the room. I crawled over to get it and kept pressing the button to turn it back on. It wouldn't turn back on. That's when I hurried over to turn on my bedside lamp. After I turned on my lamp, that's when I saw the freaked out expressions on my friends' faces and on my brother's face as well. I told them that was the most terrifying moment for the battery to die. But also, part of me believed it wasn't a coincidence. We stopped playing after that moment, and we left my room and went to the backyard just because we all were freaked out being in the house at that moment. The scariest thought was I knew I had to sleep in that room that night. After my friends left and Adam eventually went to sleep, I went back to my room. I put the Ouija board back in the box and brought it downstairs out of my room. I just felt weird sleeping in the same room with the board that night. As soon as I turned off the light, I just tried to go to sleep right away, not sitting on my phone for an hour like I usually do. As I was starting to finally drift off and fall asleep, something in my closet fell over. I immediately rose up and looked in the direction of the closet door. I flicked on the bedside lamp and walked over to the closet. It was a small walk-in closet where I keep some of my clothes. There's a light switch on the outside of the closet that turned on the light inside the closet. I didn't want to open the closet door, so I turned the light on to the closet and just looked at the bottom of the closet door. And that's when I noticed 2 feet that casted shadows on the other side of the door. I stood still and didn't move or make a sound. I kept watching the shadows. Then they slowly moved forward, and that's when I screamed. I ran to Adam's room and I explained to him what I just saw and led him to my room to show him. When I came to my room, the light in the closet was still on, but the shadows at the bottom of the door weren't there anymore. I opened the door and there was nobody in the closet, but there was something on the floor. It was a wooden box that I made in arts and crafts class that I would put my childhood memorabilia in. It somehow fell over and the contents spilled onto the floor. There was no draft in the world that would have knocked that over. It made no sense at all. I slept in my parents' bed that night, and then the next, and for a week after that, I slept in the spare bedroom. Eventually, after a while, I did start sleeping in my own bed again, but I would never forget that night. I haven't touched a Ouija board ever since. True, scary, paranormal story number 2, the Amazon Ouija board. In October of 2016, when I was a sophomore in high school, I was in a phase where I was obsessed with everything scary and supernatural. Halloween was also coming up. I also read a lot of scary stories about Ouija boards and people's experiences with them. I finally ordered a Ouija board off of Amazon, and when it arrived, I waited till it was at night when our parents were not home to use it. I convinced my little sister to try it with me. We were at the dining room table with the lights dimmed, and both of us were holding the planchette. I asked some random questions, and my sister and I both laughed because it was kind of awkward and funny using this for the first time. I started to move the planchette around, trying to creep out my sister, but she knew it was me doing it. After a few minutes of doing this, we got bored and my sister wanted to stop. I said, let's try just for a few more minutes. After a little bit more waiting for the planchette to move from some unseen entity, we decided to give up. After this, we both went to our rooms. That's when I got on my bed, turned off my light, and I looked up more Ouija board stories online. I kept reading people's experiences with them, and then I looked up why it didn't work for us. Other people had said their first time using Ouija boards, nothing happened either. So I decided to try it again later on that night, maybe around 2 or 3 in the morning. When my sister was already asleep, I went back down to the dining room table and dimmed the lights again. I once again tried to use the Ouija board, asking similar questions as a few hours ago, but just in a lower voice to try not to wake up my sister. I held the planchette with both hands, waiting for it to move, but it never did. Instead, I heard sounds from upstairs, like soft footsteps. I thought to myself, it could have been my sister. She might have heard me down here. The footsteps were followed by a muffled female voice, but it didn't quite sound like my sister's though, and the voice was coming from directly above me. The room above the dining room was our older brother's room, who was away at college. My sister wouldn't have been in there. She knows she's not allowed in that room. I was curious if my sister was playing a prank on me and made her voice to sound lower just to scare me. I went upstairs and I got to my brother's door and I put my ear up against it. That's when I was terrified to the core. What I heard gives me chills to this day. I heard the voice of an older woman. I wasn't sure how my sister could be doing a voice like that. At first, I didn't know what was being said until I realized that the voice kept saying, "Grandma's here, Georgie," over and over. That's when I realized it was the voice of my dead grandma. I felt every hair on my body stand up. It took every ounce of courage just to open the door, but I opened it. And I turned on the light and no one was inside the room. The voice had stopped. That's when I ran to my room and shut the door and locked it. I curled up under the covers. I felt the whole room spinning as I couldn't form any rational thoughts of what just happened. It was too vivid for me to have imagined it. When I finally calmed down, I did a prayer before going to sleep. I pretty much was awake all night. Even though this was 8 years ago, I still remember this as if it was last night.
My clairvoyance.
I am a 27-year-old female, and ever since I was a little girl, I've been able to see things that others can't. Whenever someone tells you something like that, it most likely means that they probably had a hard time growing up. Children with this gift simply don't understand their sensitivity to energies and how to safeguard against them. Having parents that are either closed off to the paranormal or simply won't accept it can even be harder. I shared that information with you to illustrate that this encounter wasn't my first experience with ghosts or entities. I was a teenager back then, and I was hanging out with my then good-for-nothing boyfriend. I don't remember what we were talking about when the topic got brought up, but he said, "I don't know what happened here before we moved in, but this place is definitely haunted, babe. I always get this creeped out feeling when I'm upstairs, like somebody's watching me." I never really talked to my ex about my gift with the paranormal, so I was a bit intrigued when he said this. After showing me around the house, I could sense the spirit wandering in the upstairs hallway before it disappeared in the bedroom. The second time I encountered this so-called spirit was the night of his sister's baby shower. His family came traveling in from far away that night. A fight had broke out because they had a disagreement and couldn't work things out. At that time, I walked upstairs and grabbed something from the bedroom. The upstairs hallway light was off because the bulb kept burning out. Every time it would get replaced, the bulb would wind up blowing out days after. Due to it not being replaced, I had to use my phone's flashlight to get around. I got what I came for and was heading back towards the stairwell when all of a sudden I got this feeling that I was being watched by something very angry. I stopped for a moment, looking back down the hallway, trying to tell if I was just being paranoid or something was actually there. Then, out of the shadows, an angry-looking man came charging right at me. Now, I pride myself in not being easily scared, but at that moment, I took off. I knew that what I saw was 100% paranormal. The man I saw looked like he was incomplete. He was missing pieces from his face with other parts blurred out. This ghostly man must have been angry about something. All that built up negative energy can be very dangerous even to somebody like me, who can see the paranormal with no problems at all. I could have just forgot about it, but I told myself that the apparition appeared because of all the fighting that occurred downstairs when his family came over that one night. This was the first time in a very long time that I had seen anything that frightened me. A few nights later, I showed up at my ex-boyfriend's house and once again found myself at the top of the stairs looking down. His bedroom is also located in the hallway, so as I walked to the door, I noticed that the bathroom light was on. It wasn't uncommon for him to leave the light on, but the door was also slightly cracked, casting a triangular shape on the carpet. I then saw something standing there, which blocked the light coming through. At first, I thought it was my boyfriend, so I opened the door. At first, I thought it was him, so I opened the door. My happy smile quickly faded. I realized no one was there. I ran to the bedroom and opened his door. There was my ex on his bed, on his phone. He said, "Let me guess, you saw something in the bathroom, just like I did." He told me the night prior, after leaving the restroom, the door made a noise. When he turned around, he saw that the restroom door had closed all the way by itself. When he opened it, he saw an apparition standing looking at itself in the mirror. It then slowly turned towards him. He exclaims that it was a man, an older man, who looked really angry. He bolted to his bedroom, closed the door, and eventually forgot about it. We eventually went about our night, but I couldn't get over what I saw that night. My ex and I weren't together much longer after that night, and his family never came by to visit that house. I've been told by two different psychics that I have a dark entity attached to me, following me wherever I go. After the breakup, a lot of things in my life changed. I've always wondered if whatever was inside his house attached itself to me. But who really knows? Whenever I'm alone, I can feel the ghostly entity staring at me. I don't know who he was, but I have an idea that he was a miserable man when he was alive, full of hate and anger. What's left of him now tries to torment anyone who crosses his path. But again, that's just my thoughts. I've seen his face so many times that I can accurately draw him on a piece of paper. I plan on talking to someone who knows the history of this town and perhaps can help me find out who exactly this ghostly entity was.
Scary, true paranormal story number 2. My grandfather.
Hi, my mother told me this true story. She said in 2004, my grandfather passed away from lung cancer, which devastated the whole family, especially my grandmother. I was only a few months old at the time of his passing, so I never got to know him, but I've always heard stories about him from various relatives. They said while he was alive, he was a good man. A few weeks after the funeral, my mother had been driving back home from the store with my older brother in the car, who was 3 years old at the time. As they were on their way back home, my brother said out of nowhere, "Mommy, I saw Grandpa." This caught her off guard, and all she could do was listen. "Grandpa was in my room." My mother remained silent the rest of the way home. I don't think she believed him at first. A few months later, she was in the living room, while I was on the floor playing with my toys. My mother went into the kitchen to grab a snack for me. A few seconds later, she heard me giggling. Stepping back into the room, she playfully asked me, "What are you laughing about, honey?" What she saw, however, made her pause. I was still laughing while my hands were in the air, as if someone was going to pick me up, but nobody was there. My mom quickly scooped me up in her arms and took me to the kitchen. The last occurrence happened a year later. My grandmother had been staying with us for a few weeks, and at one point, my grandfather was brought up into the conversation, and my grandmother began to cry. She was still having it hard, coping with his death. My brother, who at this time was 4 years old, told my grandmother, "Grandpa said that everything will be okay." So this compelled my mother to rush down the hallway to my brother's room to see who may be in there that he's been talking to. She swears up and down that as she entered the room, a dark, ghostly figure was standing in his room, surrounded by a strange light. When my mother called out for us to come in the room to look at the figure, and the light vanished from plain sight. When she got back to the kitchen, she tried to explain that nothing was wrong. She didn't want to upset my grandmother even more. There were no further occurrences after that day. To this day, my mother is convinced that the spirit of her father was watching over us until my grandmother finally accepted his passing over. Only then did his spirit move on. Strangely enough, I believe my mother. She wouldn't joke or lie about something like this. I did want to end this by saying that I'm not a very superstitious person, but I do believe that the dead never truly leave us. There is always some part of them that stays behind, reminding us that they are never gone.